In the last tutorial, I showed you how to turn a static site into a responsive site, and now we're going to create a sidebar with a Twitter widget in it, and from there we're going to make that sidebar, when it gets to a certain point of the browser, make it jump to between the section div and the footer div. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to code that sidebar in my section div. So this is something that's going to go, obviously, this is my section div here, and I want that sidebar to pop up right about here, right on the side. So I'm going to let it be the very first thing that pops up. So I'm going to go div class equals sidebar. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I'm going to put something in there. It's now up to you kind of what you want to decide to put in that sidebar. I'm going to go ahead and put in a Twitter widget. And you can do so by clicking on settings and then clicking on widgets. And now I can go into a widget that I've already made. I can just click create new. It doesn't matter, but I've got a one for Jimmy Woods. I'm going to go ahead and create it. And now I'm going to go ahead and take this code that it gave me. It says copy and paste the code into the HTML of your site. And I'm just going to literally paste it right into the sidebar area. Okay, so it's kind of messy right now, but you can see that I open the sidebar div, and then I paste it in this, I'll put it on the next line so you can see it and isolate it a little bit, but you can see that I have coded in the sidebar, I've got this Twitter widget. I literally just copy and pasted it. I'm going to go ahead and save it, and now I'm going to go to my style sheet and create the properties for it. So sidebar, and I'm going to add one line of code that says float to the right. Float right. I'm going to have it be a width of 30%. It's going to take up 30% of the section div. I'm going to give it a height of auto, and the border, I'm not going to put a border on there necessarily, but just so you can see it, border 1 pixel black. That way you can actually see what's happening. I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now I'm going to go here and refresh it, and there it is. And the sidebar didn't, or I guess the border didn't show up, and that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and delete that line of code. You can really make the sidebar however you want to make it, but especially for this div, this Twitter widget, it is going to work just fine. Now you'll see that some of this is kind of messing up. You can see that as the browser gets larger or smaller, that div is not necessarily fitting to the size of my section div. So I'm going to add one line of code in here. I'm telling right now the section div to be auto height, and that's fine, but I do want to have it, I've given it a minimum height of 450. I'm going to increase that to, let's make it 600. So it forces it to be a little bit taller, and then as it gets, the browser gets smaller, that's going to work out just fine. Okay, so it's working. That's the best part. It is actually working. So my sidebar does work. Now, I do want another sidebar. Okay, so what I'm going to do is really what I want to tell this browser to do is not just show the sidebar, okay, but I'm going to copy that code, and I'm going to paste it between my section div and my footer div. Okay, so now I've got two sidebars. I've got one inside my section div, and you can see that right here, and then I copy and pasted that whole div, and right here between the closing of the section div and the opening of the footer div. So I'm going to go ahead and save it, and that is not quite what I want yet. Because instead of just making this bottom one to be sidebar, I'm going to call it sidebar bottom. And I don't want it to show up just yet. I only want it to show up when the div, or when the browser gets to a certain width. Okay, so I'm going to go back in my style sheet, and I'm going to create a sidebar bottom. And I'm going to tell it to display none. That means it's not going to display. So you'll see that I created two divs. I created one called sidebar, which is showing up, and then I created one called sidebar bottom, which is not showing up. And that's exactly what I've coded here. I coded one sidebar in my section div that's showing up. And the reason I copy and pasted that is just because it's easier to do that. But instead of calling it sidebar, I called it sidebar bottom. So that's important that you differentiate the two. I've got two sidebar divs, one's on the top, one's on the bottom. Okay? And now the sidebar bottom is not showing up because I told it not to. So I'm going to go back into my style sheet, and it's all well and good, but now I have to tell the browser to, when it gets to a certain point, when it gets to a certain size, I want this, and it's going to be about here. I want this div sidebar to disappear, and I want the sidebar bottom to appear. So instead of them switching spots, really they're just, one's going to appear and one's going to disappear. So I've got to tell the browser to do that. I'm going to add some code called @media, and then I'm going to write, when the screen has a max width of 480 pixels, I want you to start doing these things. I want you to make sure that the sidebar now has a display of none. Okay, so what that's going to do is it's going to force the sidebar that I just created to not display. But more than that, I want the sidebar bottom to display. And I'm going to add some lines of code that look a lot like just a regular div that you might see. So I'm going to make it a position relative. I'm going to give it a margin left of auto. I'm going to give it a margin right auto. I'm going to give it a width of 90%, which looks a lot like my other divs, right? And there's one more line of code that I have to put in here. It's called display block. So now it's going to treat this div as a block element. Okay, and then I'm going to test it out here, and as my browser gets smaller, it pops down. Okay, so the one up here disappeared and the one down here appeared because I told it to not display the sidebar, but instead to display the sidebar bottom when it reaches a max width of 480 pixels. And I had to take out the semicolon here. For some reason I added that in, and that was messing me up. Now there's a couple more things that you can do at this point. You can change your navigation so that it's not all bunchy up here, but you can add some more code down in here that says nav li, and so it's going to display any list item in your navigation as a list item again, because before we had turned it into this inline list, and now, okay, good, awesome, it turned it into that. Now I want to turn my navigation height, I want my navigation height to be auto. So I'm going to go ahead and go to nav height auto. When I do that, it's going to make my navigation list auto, height auto. So basically when you have your browser this skinny, any change that you make below this media screen, anything you add to this style sheet will kind of be your chance to make your site unique and exactly how you want it to be at this size. So another thing I could do is I could add padding between each one of those list items. I can add another CSS property that says create padding bottom, and I'll make it like 5 pixels. So now every list item will have 5 pixel padding below it. There's a lot that you can do here. Another thing that you might want to do, and this is something that you can see that some of your images, if they're aligned left, they're going to have that text that kind of pops up there. If you want any images to kind of be treated as block elements as well, I could also say all of my images, I want them to be a width of 100%, and I want them to display as a block element, and I want them to have a margin left of auto and a margin right of auto. And what that's going to do is it's going to treat it like kind of like a div, where it's just going to be centered, and anything around it will have to be either below it or above it. Okay, so you can see that as the browser gets smaller and smaller, not only does the div of your that sidebar div pop down, but now the image also kind of and the navigation up here changes. So this is a chance for you to kind of make your site look good when the browser is pretty small. Now you'll also notice that, oh, maybe I want to make that jump a little quicker because my navigation kind of messes up at this point. I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and change this max width. Instead of 480, I'll make it like 650. That way it jumps a little bit sooner. So now as I'm closing this, you can see it jumps, and that contact doesn't jump to the bottom. Okay, so that's just a basic way to turn your site into being a responsive site with a sidebar that that moves around as the browser gets smaller.